In order to round off our investigations into the nuclear waste disposal methods of the Mass Fusion Company, we next go to Lake Quannapowitt. We learned in my video on the Mass Fusion containment shed that Mass Fusion was dumping toxic waste into a broken pipe under their facility. I theorized at the time that this pipe led directly into nearby Lake Quannapowitt. This evidence was substantiated by our visit to the Nahat Oceanological Society, where we found a terminal entry telling us that the scientists there had determined that Lake Quannapowitt's toxicity had risen by nearly 15% compared to the year previously. Remember, this is before the bombs dropped. And when we visited the Mass Fusion disposal site, we discovered that Mass Fusion had been dumping barrels of toxic waste into unoccupied land that drained into a nearby lake. Lake Quannapowitt lies just north of the General Atomics Galleria. That place is swarming with monsters of all kinds. As soon as you arrive, you'll likely have to dispatch a few mirelurks. Let's explore the shore of the lake first to see if we can come up with any evidence. We'll start by going towards the southern shore. Here we find an overturned red boat. It's a large boat, seemingly too large for such a small lake as this. This lake is in the middle of the mainland. There's no outlet to the ocean. What is a boat of this size doing upside down in a lake? Perhaps it was lifted and deposited here in the early days after the war. It would be large enough to explore on the inside, perhaps turned into a temporary home, but we do not find any hatches and we can't get underneath it. Nearby in a rowboat, we find the skeleton of a man with a fishing pole and a pistol. It may be that after the bombs dropped, this man, filled with despair, rowed out into the middle of his favorite fishing hole and committed suicide. Then the winds pushed his rowboat back to shore. Continuing along, we hop on top of a trailer to dispatch another mirelurk. And we find a whole lot of bloodleaf at this location. I walked away with a stack of 20 plus bloodleaf, so if you need bloodleaf for any of your chem crafting, this is the place to go. At length, we reach another rowboat next to a rusted out car and a river. Let's follow this river to see where it goes. The river leads to a pipe that goes underneath a road. Inside the pipe are a bunch of mirelurk eggs, great for crafting those mirelurk egg omelets. And when you get halfway through the pipe, a mirelurk jumps up to defend its nest.
You're already dead.
On the road above the pipe, we find a ruined truck and a huge boat. How did the boat get on the road? I think this is more evidence that the crazy wild weather that happened just after the bombs dropped was wild enough to move very large and heavy objects. Although it could be that the truck was transporting the ship somewhere when the bombs dropped. That said, I don't see how they could keep this ship, which does not have a flat bottom, on top of the truck. It seems pretty rickety to me. Continuing along the river, we come face to face with a behemoth. And soon we come upon our first evidence that illegal dumping might have taken place here. We find a few rusted out barrels in the river, but they are not marked with toxic waste labels and they don't give off radiation when you get near. So perhaps these are simply oil barrels. I don't know if you'll find this in your game, but in mine, as I followed the river around, I came to a road, and on the road was a deactivated sentry bot. A pretty powerful one, an Annihilator Mark II. I was able to use my hacker perk to turn it into a temporary companion. Looking at the map, we see that we've gone at a bit of a circle. We went under the road through the pipe, past Recon Bunker Theta, and now we're heading back towards Lake Quannapowitt. Soon the river ends in a T-junction. Turning left goes back to the lake, and turning right goes through yet another pipe. But this is where the river ends. So it must not be a true river. It's mainly just an extension of the lake itself. The water has flown off in this big loop, but it doesn't lead us anywhere else interesting. Back at the lake and heading northwest, we reach some docks. These are laid out with picnic tables. They were clearly intended for the public to relax and drink a cold one while fishing. On one of the tables, we find fishing tournament ad. This tells us of a bass fishing tournament that happened on July 4th, 2077 between 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. Sponsored by both General Atomics and the City of Boston. They lured people to come with big cash prizes and invited people to bring their friends and their family. We find a flyer like this in the ruins of the Boston airport as well, so they had been advertising this heavily before the war. The strange thing is that it's dated July 4th. This was many months before the bombs dropped. What is this still doing here? Did somebody leave this flyer out the day of the big bass tournament and no one cleaned it up in the months after that until the bombs dropped? That seems a little strange to me. I wonder if there's another explanation. Continuing along the shore southwest, we see a shack in the distance with some sort of water tower above it. As soon as we get close, we get attacked by mirelurks.
Shouldn't take long. Area secured.
Inside the shack, on a desk that has a terminal, we find 2 more notes. The first is a legal notice. This is dated July 19th, a couple of weeks after the Big Bass Tournament, from J. Richard Thorndike, the city attorney, to all employees. We learned that the city got sued by, quote, the survivors and families of the Lake Quannapowitt boating incident. Incident? What on earth happened here? At the very end, he says we extend our condolences to the victims of this terrible tragedy. And then strangely, beneath the typewritten note, he writes with his hand, wipe the terminal, JT. Sounds like the bass fishing tournament was interrupted by something tragic. The note says that employees are to retain any printed documents relating to the bass fishing tournament, which helps explain why we still found one at the Boston Airport ruins and on that picnic table. It also explains why we find another one underneath the legal note. Let's see if they really did wipe the terminal. Inside, we find 2 terminal entries. The first is water quality status, and this is tragic. The entry lists all of the different contaminants in this lake. Extreme levels of radioactive contaminants, extreme levels of heavy metal contaminants, extreme levels of fecal contaminants. Moderate levels of dissolved oxygen, extreme levels of other contaminants. Overall status, hazardous. The contaminants exceeded the sensor tolerance. The entry ends by saying, contact with this water may be hazardous to human health. The next entry is a collection of incident reports. The first is June 1st, 77. They note that contaminant levels are 3 times higher than previous recordings. They suspect, and here we go, that illegal dumping remains the most likely cause. They recommend closing the lake to the public and beginning a formal inquiry into the waste management practices of General Atomics, Saugus Ironworks, and Corvega. It's interesting that they don't list mass fusion here. On June 25th, they measured contaminant levels again and noted that they continued to rise. This inspector recommended closing the lake and canceling the mayor's fishing tournament. But it looks like this inspector was not listened to because, as we know from the legal notice, the fishing tournament went on anyway. And then we find an entry from July 4th, the day of the tournament. The tournament resulted in 27 reports of serious illness following contact with the water. 1 boat sank, its 2 surviving crew were treated for critical radiation burns. Of course, no fish were caught. Finally, they closed Lake Quannapowitt to the public forever. What's most perplexing about this to me is that on July 4th, 20-some-odd people received serious injuries simply from contacting the water. All they had to do was touch it. But these government officials had been inspecting the lake many months prior. If all it takes to figure out that this is toxic to human health is to touch the water, why didn't somebody try that? How come a few deaths and 20-some-odd injured people came as a surprise to the government if they already knew that it was so toxic? Are they trying to tell us that they only used machines and instruments to test the water for months before the fishing tournament? Nobody from the government bothered to just stick their hand in the water to see what would happen? On the nearby dock, we find the skeleton of a man next to a tool case. My bet is that he was a repairman for whatever machine lies right next to him. It's a large machine, looks like some sort of pump. Maybe they had installed this in an attempt to pump out the water and find out what was at the bottom of the lake, or simply to pump out the contaminants. Continuing along the shore south, we find a recess in the rock. Kind of looks like a small cave where we would typically find Yao Guai, but there's nothing here. We do come upon even more mirelurks.
There's someone at all knows you That's it.
And then we pass some half-buried tanks and a forklift before we arrive back to where we began. This leaves only one thing left to do. We need to explore the depths of the lake itself. Well, after everything we've read, I, for one, am a little nervous what is going to happen to us. If you have Aqua Boy or Aqua Girl, maybe a simple hazmat suit will be enough, but if not, using the rescue diver's suit from Far Harbor will come in handy here. As soon as we splash into the water, the first thing we see are nuclear waste barrels right next to a broken bathtub. Right. Oh my gosh, this is going far beyond just dumping toxic waste into a buried pipe that leads to the lake. Now someone is actually dumping the barrels themselves in the lake, just like a certain somebody dumped barrels into the mass fusion disposal site. Now remember, Aqua Boy and Aqua Girl only protect you from radiation that normally comes with the water. The perk doesn't protect you from radiation emanating from these barrels or from any other contaminated source in the lake. The rescue diver suit is not a hazmat suit, so it doesn't help us quite as much as a hazmat suit would. As we explore near these barrels, notice that my rads skyrocket. Near this site, we find a wooden crate with some random loot inside. Diving deeper, we come to a buried steamer trunk where we find a stash of chems. This stash of chems only appears in the trunk if you have the miscellaneous quest Treasure Hunt active in your quest log. As you wander the Commonwealth, you can sometimes find the corpse of a junkie on the ground. Looting a note on the junkie's body will activate the miscellaneous quest Treasure Hunt, which will send you to some random location in the Commonwealth to uncover a stash of chems. Lake Quannapowitt is one of the locations for this stash of chems, and you find them in this underwater trunk. It's next to a sunken rowboat with a few skeletons inside. These are likely the casualties from the July 4th bass fishing tournament. These are likely their remains. Exploring the bottom of this lake is a horror show. We find piles of barrels after piles of barrels. There's a red toolbox with some random loot in it. We find barrels next to a rusting car, barrels next to a refrigerator. In the refrigerator, we find a cooler with some bottle caps and rat away. The deepest portion where we found the chest has the most radiation. If you're not wearing a hazmat suit, you can get up to 41 rads per second. That puts the glowing sea to shame. If you're careless like me and you stop paying attention to your rad meter, it is entirely possible to die from radiation alone. So what went on here? Well, I don't think there's any room for doubt. Mass Fusion was illegally dumping toxic nuclear waste into Lake Quannapowitt. Not only were they dumping it into a broken pipe in the Mass Fusion containment shed, which led directly to the lake, but just like they did at the disposal site, they were trucking huge barrels of nuclear waste to the lake and dumping them, possibly contracting the wicked shipping company to do so. They had dealings with them in the past. But we also learned that mass fusion is not wholly at fault. Remember, there were heavy metals and fecal contamination in the lake, plus a bunch of other stuff that they couldn't identify. It's likely that Saugus Ironworks, their Corvega assembly plant, and General Atomics also used this lake to dump their waste. What a nightmare for the poor citizens of the Commonwealth who lived here before the war. They just came to this lake for a simple little bass fishing tournament for some time with their family on the 4th of July, and so many people were injured or died. We often talk about the monsters in the post-apocalyptic world, the horrible raiders, the evils of the Institute and the Brotherhood of Steel, but part of me thinks that pre-war corporations and the pre-war government and the pre-war military were just as evil and corrupt and horrible as these post-war entities. All of this is one more reminder that utopia never has and never will exist. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the sad story of Lake Quannapowitt, mass fusion and their dumping tactics, and the Nahant Oceanological Society, all bound together in a sordid pre-war tale. But what are your thoughts on Lake Quannapowitt and how mass fusion dealt with their nuclear waste? Do we have a moral or ethical right to be incensed by their behavior? Or is this just to be expected and we're naive buffoons for expecting these companies to act ethically? Let me know in the comments section below. I read all of your comments and I use them as inspiration for my future videos. I publish a new video every single day of the week, so if you like this video and if you want to be notified when I publish my video tomorrow, be sure to subscribe. And if you'd like to chat about this topic with like-minded individuals on the Oxhorn Community Discord server, be sure to click that Discord invitation link in the description below. And if you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. Patreon subscribers get access to a private channel on my Discord server, as well as a bunch of other cool Oxhorn perks. But more than anything, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just so glad that you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow morning, bright and early, with a brand new video.